On November 24, 1326, a big crowd gathers at the marketplace in Hereford, England. Nobles, clergy, merchants, and peasants, all eager to see a grim show of justice. At the center, high above the crowd, a wooden platform is set up. Guards lead a man around 40 years old onto it. His face is pale and haggard from days without food. His once fine clothing is now tattered and filthy. This man, who was once second only to the king himself, is about to be executed in a brutal way that history will remember for ages. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's favorite and rumored lover, King Edward II of England. Soon his mutilated body will serve as a grisly warning of what happens when someone rises too high and makes powerful enemies. To grasp how Hugh ended up here, we need to rewind and dive into the tangled web of power, ambition, love, and betrayal in early 14th century England. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286, the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder and Isabel Beauchamp, daughter of the Earl of Warwick. Growing up in a noble family, he had a privileged upbringing. His father was loyal to King Edward I, the father of Edward II, so the Despenser family already held significant wealth and influence. From a young age, Hugh was groomed to serve the crown and increase the family's power. When Edward II took the throne in 1307, things changed. The new king was known for favoring male companions. His first close friend, Piers Gaveston, caused quite a scandal, monopolizing the king's affection and showing disrespect to the nobility. After Gaveston was murdered in 1312 by angry barons, a power vacuum opened up in the king's circle. Hugh Despenser was ready to seize his chance. By 1316, he had formed a close bond with Edward and became his chamberlain, a role that gave him constant access to the king. At the same time, Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, which brought him even more power through the rich lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. Hugh the Despenser's power took off like a rocket. He craved land and riches, and he used his influence over the king to twist the legal system in his favor. Nobles suffered, and even vulnerable widows weren't spared. He went so far as to force his own sister-in-law to hand over her valuable properties. During a baronial rebellion in 1321, he was temporarily exiled from England, but he returned with a bang. He even tried his hand as a pirate, raiding English merchant ships, completely ignoring the law. When Edward II regained control of the rebellious nobility, Hugh came back from exile stronger than ever. From 1322 to 1326, the Despensers, father and son, didn't just take part in the government, they ran it. Hugh the Younger was in charge of access to the king, controlled royal finances, and managed extensive lands. A medieval historian, Jean Froissart, remarked that Hugh was like the King of England, minus the title. But things got even more explosive, due to whispers about Hugh's relationship with Edward. Even though Hugh was married with kids, rumors flew around court that he and the king were rather close. They called him a sodomite, a term back then for homosexual relations, which the church viewed as sinful and socially unacceptable. Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife and the daughter of the King of France, couldn't stand Hugh. She felt humiliated by the king's clear favoritism toward his companion. Hugh's interference increasingly cut into Isabella's power, resources, and even her access to her own kids. In 1324, he went to the extreme of seizing the queen's lands and locking up some of her household members. He even took the royal couple's children away from her and handed them over to his wife. Isabella's anger boiled over when in 1325 she was sent to France to negotiate peace. There, she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had escaped from the Tower of London after standing up to the Despensers. They became lovers and allies, plotting to overthrow Edward II and his favorite. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer stormed back into England with a small army. The speed with which the English nobility sided with the invaders shocked Edward and the Despensers. Years of mistreatment had fueled deep resentment against the king's favorites. With their support crumbling, Edward II and the Despensers fled west, taking a chunk of the royal treasury with them. But their escape was doomed. Father and son were soon separated. Hugh, the elder, was captured in Bristol. He faced a swift and brutal execution on October 27, 1326. He was hanged while still in his armor, then beheaded, with his body chopped up and tossed to the dogs. A grim fate for a man who served the crown for so long. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh the Younger were still on the run across Wales. Almost all their supporters had deserted them. By mid-November, they were caught near Neath. Edward was taken prisoner and would have to give up his throne to his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. As for Hugh Despenser, his situation turned dire. Knowing mercy wasn't an option, he tried to starve himself, but it failed. On November 24th, he faced a trial run by his enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the barons he had wronged. This trial was a brutal formality. Hugh was charged with treason, theft, corruption, and manipulating the king. To make it seem less personal, the tribunal dressed it up in legal terms, but the result was clear from the start. Hugh was found guilty and sentenced to one of the most terrible executions in English history. On the morning of November 24th, Hugh was brought to the market square in Hereford, where a massive crowd had gathered, including Mortimer, Isabella, and the victorious barons. What happened next was a carefully staged show of public vengeance. Hugh was tied to a tall ladder for everyone to see. A crown of nettles was placed on his head, mocking the royal crown he had shared with Edward. Biblical verses condemning pride and evil were inscribed on his skin. Then the real torture began. Chronicler John Froissart described the brutal execution of Hugh. The executioners castrated him and burned his genitals right in front of him. This punishment was meant to shame him for his alleged sexual practices while he remained awake. They cut open his belly, slowly pulled out his insides, and burned those too. Witnesses said Hugh let out a terrible, inhuman scream that echoed through the square, delighting the crowd. After enduring this torture for some time, he was finally hanged. But even in death, his humiliation didn't stop. His body was beheaded and chopped into 4 pieces, which were sent to different cities to be displayed. His head was stuck on a stake at London Gate, a grim reminder of what happens to those who abuse power. The brutal nature of Hugh Despenser's execution served multiple purposes. It was revenge for the cruelty and greed he had shown during his rise to power. It also symbolically rid the kingdom of what many believed was the pollution he spread through his influence over Edward II and his supposed relationship with him. The public castration was a glaring punishment for his alleged sexual misconduct. 4 years later, in December 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, got permission to collect and bury the remains on their family property in Gloucestershire. Sadly, only a head, a femur, and a few fragments were recovered. It was a disgraceful end for someone who had once been the second most powerful man in England. Edward II's fate was equally grim. He was initially kept as a prisoner and murdered in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. The lasting story about his death, though debated by some historians, claims he was killed with a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum. This method left no visible marks but hinted at his alleged sexual practices. The grim symbolism of his death mirrored the twisted justice seen in Hugh's fate. The reign of Edward II and the rise and fall of Hugh Despenser mark a chaotic chapter in medieval English history. For centuries, the stories surrounding these men have been colored by homophobia and condemnation of their relationship. Edward was seen as a weak king, overpowered by his personal desires, while Hugh was painted as a ruthless manipulator who took advantage of the monarch. Modern historians have a more layered perspective on Hugh Despenser. On one hand, they see him as a greedy, ruthless politician who managed to make nearly all the English nobility turn against him. On the other hand, they raise doubts about some of the sensational stories regarding his relationship with Edward II. They point out that accusations of sodomy were often used as political tools to discredit opponents. Regardless of the truth about their relationship, Hugh Despenser's fate reflects the risky ties between power, sexuality, and politics in medieval England. His mutilated body and public execution served as a stark warning about what could happen if someone defied societal norms and made powerful enemies. Hugh's story also shows how justice back then could be shockingly theatrical. His execution wasn't just about punishment, it was a public display meant to send political and moral messages. The way his body was treated, especially the very public act of castration, was filled with heavy meanings regarding sexual misconduct, political greed, and the need to restore order. Hugh Despenser's rise was dramatic. He went from an unknown knight to the kingdom's most powerful man in just a few years. But his fall was equally spectacular, ending with his quartered body displayed at four corners of England. His life is one of the stark examples of how political fortunes could shift in the medieval era. In an ironic twist, the new regime led by Queen Isabella and her partner Roger Mortimer, who oversaw Hugh's gruesome execution, wouldn't last long either. Just 4 years later, when young Edward III took control, Mortimer would meet a similar fate. Hanged as a traitor, though he avoided the extra tortures, the wheel of medieval power had spun again. Even now, nearly 700 years later, Hugh Despenser's story continues to captivate and disturb people. Recently, he was named the greatest British villain of the 14th century and even ranked among the worst Britons ever. His tale has been brought to life in plays, novels, and television shows, often depicting him as the ultimate corrupt manipulator. Today, when we look back at his cruel execution, we can't help but feel horror at the extreme brutality of it all. This tale gives us a glimpse into the medieval justice system, but it goes beyond just history. It shows us that the games of power, favoritism, and the abuse of privilege are still happening today. The story of the king's favorite, who was castrated and hanged for all to see, serves as a striking reminder. It helps us think about the messy ties between power, sexuality, greed, and justice, issues that still impact our lives now.